Okay, class. Sorry, no video on chapter 12. I had some technical difficulties, so you're only going to get sound on chapter 12, and you won't be able to look at me. So you're probably thinking, oh, that's a good thing. Here's chapter 12 on associations and interest groups, and you can see here the bullet points on what we'll cover here for this lecture for chapter 12. So we've talked about family and marriage and kinship, and just got done with some of the more complex ways that non-commercial societies look at kinship. And in this chapter, we move on to associations, which are typically more non-kin or non-territorial groups. So different types of groups that where they're not necessarily related to one another. Or they don't have that kinship relation. And so that's what chapter 12 is about, is associations and interest groups. And so to kind of look at what is an association, it's an organized group not based exclusively on kinship or territory. And characteristics then would be some kind of formal institutional structure. So has to have some kind of rules. It can't just be this informal, haphazard kind of thing. So it's kind of it's institutional, it's formal, it's got rules, it's got ways of relating to one another, interactions, that sort of thing. Another characteristic is the exclusion of some people. So there are some people within the society that are excluded from membership. So it's a sub part of a society. Another characteristic would be that the members have some kind of interest or purpose. And then finally, another characteristic of an association is that there's kind of this mutual pride amongst the people involved in belonging to that particular association. So the chapter talks about association and interest groups to distinguish between the two. So their membership in interest groups is voluntary, and sometimes we'll see with associations that's not the case. So you might have heard of these two different terms before: achieved qualities and ascribed qualities, and how we'll discuss how they relate to associations here in chapter 12. So achieved qualities are those that people acquire during their lifetime. So, things like maybe skills at a certain sport, or a certain trade, like an electrician or something like that. Ascribed qualities are those that we are born with, so they're determined at birth. And it's either by sex or because of some family background. So it might be your ethnicity or your religion or your social class, that sort of thing. So in our society, in our culture, we have associations, but they're typically voluntary associations. So you may remember, so we'll see later on in the chapter that a military group would be an association. And at various times in our history, we've had the draft, which would mean that it's non-voluntary, but today our military is voluntary. And most of our associations in our culture, as being a more complex commercial culture, we have more voluntary associations, whereas relatively unstratified or egalitarian societies typically have non-voluntary associations. So you don't really have a choice in those types of societies, and they're either and a lot of times it's based on what's called age-sets and unisex associations. So the book talks about age grades and age sets. An age grade is a category of people who fall within a culturally distinguished age range. Rather, on the other hand, an age set is a group of people of the same age and the same sex who kind of move through life stages together. And then unisex associations means, when we think unisex, we might think either or, but in this case it means one sex. So it's either a male association or a female association. Okay, so here's table 12.1. that gives examples of associations and membership criteria and recruitment and that sort of thing. So you see some terms along the side there: universally ascribed and variably ascribed, and then achieved. So if you remember back from a couple of slides ago, we talked about what ascribed qualities were and what achieved qualities were. So remember, ascribed are those that are given to you at birth, and achieved are ones that you come about with during your lifetime. So universally ascribed means these are ones that we see in nearly all cultures. Variably means that not necessarily seen in all cultures. So examples of universally ascribed, and these again are usually non-voluntary, usually egalitarian societies, are age sets and unisex groups. Variably ascribed, if it's non-voluntary, a lot of times it's like what I was talking about on the previous slide, the draft. Or if it's more voluntary, it might be some kind of an ethnic based association or regional association. And then in achieved, it could be occupational or political or some kind of special interest. So it's something that you kind of develop during your lifetime. So again, we've already defined age sets, but they are groups of people of a similar age and the same sex who move through some of or all of life stages together. And we can think about this in our, even though this isn't as important in our society as it is in these egalitarian societies that have non-voluntary associations. You know, we can think about our friends that we grew up with in school and how we all went through puberty together. A lot of us got married around the same time, had kids, etc. And so we do, you know, kind of have these age sets, but they're not as formal or prominent as they are in egalitarian societies with these non-voluntary associations. So the book gives two examples. You can see on page 288 and 289, these are both pretty good examples of, and again, they're egalitarian societies of non-voluntary associations based on age sets. And we'll see in the next slide an example of and how kind of it's somewhat arbitrary, but you know, how you can take certain age range and say this is a particular group of a particular association with these particular tasks or interests. So here the Karimojong age system is composed of 4 distinct generation sets. And again, you can kind of see how this is somewhat arbitrary, but and then obviously you succeed each other in kind of this cyclical fashion, and you think, well, you know, age is kind of a linear thing, young to old, and then you die. But the youth are always taking over for the older generation set. So you've kind of got these not yet initiated boys, and then a junior generation set, a senior generation set, and a retired generation set. So, and then kind of broken up in between. And so this is a good example of a non-voluntary association, or also known as an age set. And so another type of non-voluntary association besides an age set is a unisex association. So they restrict membership to one sex, usually male. And again, we could go back to our chapter on gender and gender stratification. So a lot of times it's, and we saw this too kind of on the last slide, so you kind of go through these certain rituals a lot of times in these non-commercial cultures, kind of a rite of passage sort of thing. And so it may be that at a certain point that the male will be completely separated or mostly separated from women, and there's an obvious distinction or association, kind of like a men's group sort of thing in these particular societies. The book does give example of one woman's association, but again, typically it's male. So in our society, we tend to see more voluntary associations, so in more stratified or complex societies. It could be something like a military association, and even after retiring from a military association, so the book points out something like the American Legion or a veterans group, that sort of thing. So some kind of bringing together of people that have served in the military and all sorts of associations in our culture based on military associations. Regional associations, and the upcoming slides will get into these a little bit more, so I'm just going to kind of quickly introduce them here. But regional associations typically bring together migrants from a common geographic background, and then ethnic associations. We typically find these in cities all over the world, but as the name applies, based on ethnicity. Rotating credit associations, that's where the members are giving in some sort of contribution of money or gifts or whatever it might be, and then they're subsequently given out and to particular people and that sort of thing. Multi-ethnic associations are, just as they imply, they're people from the same regional or ethnic background, but they may draw members from many different backgrounds. And then just kind of a general other interest group. So again, military associations exist to unite members through their common experience as warriors, or to glorify the activities of war and perform certain services for the community. And so, you can think about our own military associations. I wouldn't necessarily say those would glorify the activities of war, but they're just bring together a common group of people who have served in the military, may or may not have served during a wartime. But a lot of times, even with our military associations in our society, there's some kind of services that they'll provide for the community. So again, regional associations typically bring together migrants from a common geographic background. So you've got people moving into a country. They might be spread out all over the country, but if they live together in a particular group of cities or states or whatever, they might get together in these regional associations. And as the social conditions change over time, maybe more acceptance of migrant workers, that sort of thing, the function of these regional associations may change along with that. Okay, so ethnic associations, again, as the name implies, membership is based largely on ethnicity, which we defined in Chapter 8 and made a distinction between ethnicity and race categories. So examples from the book would be like tribal unions from Nigeria or Ghana, and they will sometimes recruit members into these tribal union type things. And again, there's some kind of formal institutionalized aspect to it. The book talks about, in this case, publications, education, that sort of thing. And then there's these so-called friendly societies, and a lot of times the function of these are for mutual aid. So if they need help between different members of the association, they're there for each other, that sort of thing. So a rotating credit association, again, is the idea here is that each member of the group makes a regular contribution, whether it's money or gifts or whatever it might be, into a fund, which is then handed over to each member in rotation. And so there's an economic aspect involved here, and it's sort of like we were just discussing with the friendly societies. It's kind of a mutual aid sort of thing to help members of the association out. So multi-ethnic associations, they're increasingly voluntary groups that draw members from different backgrounds. So again, what separates them from ethnic associations is that they don't all necessarily have the same ethnicity, or maybe the same regional background, and may come together for independence movements. So if they're a group of people that live within a certain geographic boundary, have multiple ethnicities, but have a common goal of independence, then they will draw together in these types of multi-ethnic associations. So you can think in our particular culture, there's all sorts of interest groups, voluntary associations that you can join to A lot of, since we're in college, we could talk about different academic groups. The American Anthropological Association would be an example. So it might be based on some kind of academic interest, some kind of career interest, some kind of recreational interest, those sorts of things. So there's all sorts of these voluntary associations in complex societies, and a lot of times based off achieved interests, not so much ascribed.